Jesus provides a rest. Wonderful story of love for all the pure and blessed. Rest in those mansions above us, with those who've gone on before us, singing the rapturous chorus. Wonderful story of love. 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 Tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love. Wake the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it. Shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. 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 Though you are far away, wonderful story of love. Still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, e'en from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love.
You got your Bibles, turn to the 19th chapter of the book of 1 Kings. This was the first day of last week's reading where this chapter was included in the reading. And I guess I'll start by reading the first 4 verses. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." Little background information on Elijah the prophet during King Ahab's reign, and particularly over the last 3 years of when these events that we just read are taking place. Elijah has prayed a prayer to God and asked that God would withhold the rain, and God had done so for 3.5 years. They were in the midst of a terrible drought, and Ahab and Jezebel, well, they hate Elijah. They had been systematically killing off the prophets of God, and had it not been for one man, Obadiah, they probably would have got them all. He was able to preserve 100 of them by bringing them to a cave and feeding them bread and water and protecting them. And what goes on here is Elijah shows up at the end of this 3.5 years after they have been searching diligently to find him, and he presents himself to Obadiah and he says, "Look, you go to your Lord and you tell him that I'm here and I want to see him." And he says, "What did I do to you? If I go and tell Ahab, after he's been looking for you all of this time, that you're here, he's going to think I've been hiding you from him, and he's going to kill me." And what Elijah says to him is, "Well, it doesn't really matter what you do, because before today ends, I will stand before him and we'll talk to him." And so Elijah confronts Ahab at the end of this long period of drought that was brought on by his prayer. After confronting Ahab, he challenges the prophets of Baal to a contest on Mount Carmel. Now, what happened is Jezebel had brought in the worship of Baal. They now have 450 prophets of Baal that are in the land. And as I mentioned, they have been systematically killing off all of the prophets of God. And at this point, Elijah feels like he's all by himself, but he's very bold. And he goes to the one who's seeking to kill him, and he challenges him, and he challenges these 450 prophets to this contest on Mount Carmel. And he tells them to call down their God and to do something. And they, of course, spend all day long trying to call Baal into action, and nothing happens. And the whole time Elijah is mocking them. And then Elijah, as the day ends, builds an altar, and he puts an offering on the altar, and he puts not fire on the altar, but instead empties gallons and gallons and gallons of water onto this altar, and then calls for the God of heaven. And God sends down fire from heaven and consumes not only the offering, but consumes the stones of the altar, consumes all the water, licks up everything, it says, and there's nothing left. And following that display of the power of God, Elijah takes a sword and slays all 450 prophets of Baal. And that is what the opening of chapter 19 says, is that Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. And that, of course, just made Jezebel even more livid than she was and more intent to do harm to Elijah than she has. The event right after this great demonstration of the power of God on Mount Carmel was Elijah prayed to God again, and almost immediately a rain cloud forms over the water, comes up on land, and it rains. Again, demonstrating this great power of God. So Jezebel's just irate and threatens Elijah's life, says basically in the next 24 hours, you're going to be dead. And so Elijah flees to first Beersheba, and then leaving his servant in the city of Beersheba, he goes out into the desert, a day's journey all by himself. And that's where we find things as chapter 19 opens. And so what we see in all this is this great victory. Here he was with all of this courage and strength, the knowledge that God was with him and that he wasn't afraid of Ahab and Jezebel, and he went and presented himself to Ahab, though he was being searched by him and wanted to be killed by him. And he says, well, here I am right here before you. And you'll recall that exchange. He sees him and he says, oh, are you the troubler of Israel? And Elijah says, no, it's not me. You're the troubler of Israel. And he challenges him on all the evil that he has allowed to come into the land. He's stood up to the 400 prophets of Baal by himself, and he has saw the power of God and known the answer of God. He knows God's listening to him. Because when he calls for God to act, God immediately acts. Both with the sacrifice and then with the rain. And Elijah now knows that God has been with him for 3.5 years, because this whole drought started with him asking for God to withhold the rain. And so you see all of this faith and all of this victory, and this has got to be a high point. And it immediately turns into fear. With this threat from Jezebel. So he travels and he goes to Beersheba. That's the place where Abimelech and Abraham made their agreement. We just read about that's where it got its name from, the well of sevens. There's the sacrifice that was made and a treaty that was entered into there. And then he journeys on into the wilderness a day and then sits down under a broom tree and kind of goes through this period of self-pity. And the angel of the Lord speaks to him and tells him to get some rest, tells him to take some food. He's going to need his strength because he is about to go on this big journey, and he lights out from this place in the wilderness to Mount Horeb. Now, he travels for 40 days and 40 nights. That's what verse 8 says. He arose and he ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. Now, this is the same area where Moses was called at the burning bush in Horeb. At the foot of the mount is where he sees this burning bush, and Moses is sent in to deliver the people out of Egypt. It's also the place that Moses returned to after he led the people out of Egypt to receive the law of God. And in that case, when he goes up onto the mountain, guess how long Moses stays on the mountain receiving the Ten Commandments? 40 days and 40 nights. And so there's a connection to the place, there's a connection to the timeline. It's an interesting timeline. I know that Mount Sinai is what it's called in the book of Exodus, this mount, but it's said to be in Horeb throughout the book of Deuteronomy, and it appears to be the same place. The area was apparently Horeb, and the mount in Horeb was known as the Mount of God and called Mount Sinai. It may be significant that 40 days and 40 nights is this recurring time frame throughout the Bible for all sorts of major events, but the two that immediately pop into my head is Moses and his 40 days of fast, and Jesus and his 40 days. And for 40 days, he goes on the strength that food that he just ate supplied him. And so we've got these three people who spend this period of 40 days in fasting and trial. And also in communication with the God of heaven, these three men, Moses, Elijah, and the Lord. There's a symbolism that has to be noticed in all of the time frames here. So he gets to Mount Horeb, and we read in verse 9, he finds shelter in a cave. And this is probably the part of the story that most of us are most familiar with, in the sense that we have heard this part of the story a lot. The Lord comes to him and he asks him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah offers his answer. And then the Lord instructs him to go stand on the mountain. So he goes out to the entrance of the cave, and he stands at the entrance of the cave, and this powerful wind blows, and it says that Elijah didn't see the Lord in the wind. It says that there was this great earthquake, and that the Lord wasn't in the earthquake. It says that there was this great fire that passes by, but the Lord is not in the fire. And after all of that power is displayed and grandiose chaos is displayed, there comes this gentle breeze and a whisper connected with that. And Elijah knows and recognizes the Lord's presence in that gentle whisper. Verse 13 of our context. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in a cloak, went out and stood at the entrance of the cave, and behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" That's the second time he's been asked that same question. The beginning of this story starts that way, and the end of it ends that way. What are you doing here? Elijah rehearses his exact same answer. Verse 14, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And there's a couple of things about Elijah's answer that we do want to take note of. It is an answer that recognizes his own faith, his own value. I have been very jealous for the Lord. I am the only one that's left. And it's very judgmental about all the people around him. The people of Israel have forsaken your covenant. The people of Israel have thrown down your altars. The people of Israel have killed your prophets with the sword. Now, the fact of the matter is all the people of Israel hadn't been doing that. Some people of Israel had been doing that. But the mindset of Elijah is what we need to know. Everything he sees in himself is, I'm doing all the right things. And everything he sees in others is, they're not doing the right things. And that is a big part of where Elijah finds himself in this vast swing from probably the greatest day of his work, where God is clearly with him and acting and responding to his request, and he's defeating all of these false prophets, and he is facing off his mortal enemy Ahab, and he is bringing back the rain, and he is doing all of these great and magnificent things, and 24 hours later, he wants to die. And I would suggest to you that in large part it's because he is focused upon himself and his appraisement of himself about how faithful he is, while he is critical of everyone else and everything else around him. And it steals all of his joy. It steals all of his confidence. It steals away all of his faith. So he says, I've been very jealous for the Lord, but the people of Israel have forsaken the Lord. I'm the only one left. And so God replies to him. And he says to Elijah that he needs to go, that he has things to accomplish. Look with me in verse 15. The Lord said to him, Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint to be king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel Menholah you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. The one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. There are several things that are going on here. First, he's asking basically the same thing that the story started with when he was sitting self-pitying himself under but what are you doing here? And then he repeats it at the cave, and he repeats it a second time at the cave. What are you doing? Why are you sitting here? You have work that you ought to be accomplishing. You have kings to anoint. You have to pass your mantle on to the next prophet who will take your place, Elisha. You have things that you ought to be doing, and instead, you're sitting here in despair. And I'm going to render judgment against Israel. And ultimately understand that God is saying to Elijah, look, this is my job. It's my job to determine who is with me and who is not. And I will bring judgment against them through these kings and through my prophet. And I'll go ahead and let you know when I'm done. There's going to be 7,000 people left who are faithful, godly people who have never left me. Now, the hard part of this is the application part. We too can go from days of great victory in our faith, days when things go well and when our prayers seem to be answered and we're getting all of the things that we want to happen, and people are congratulating us on the wonderful things that we're done, and telling us how important we are to them, and saying to us how valuable our service is. We have those days when everything seems to be clicking. Those days when we open up this book and we read and we study and we see things that we've never quite understood, and we see them clearly for the first time, and we've learned something new, and we're excited about that, and our faith is way up on the mountaintop. And overnight, those days become days of depression and fear, where we forget about God, we forget about what God is saying, we forget about the work that God has given us to do. We think we're the only ones, we think no one else is good enough. We quit listening to God. And that's what causes the problem. We quit listening to God and we inflate our personal faithfulness while criticizing the faithfulness of all others around us. And I hear this a lot. I feel this even sometimes, and I have to discipline myself and say, what am I thinking? But it's a very real circumstance, and the question is, how do I deal with it? How do I keep from staying in that place where my faith is gone, where I have no motivation to do anything? And I want you to notice the contrast between Elijah's spirit here, where he's out there in the wilderness all by himself, thinking that nobody else is faithful to God, and saying, just take my life now. It is enough. Take away my life, for I'm no better than my father's. Where are we going to find hope? You'll recall that Paul, when confronted with death, said, I don't really know which one to choose, which is better. To live on in the flesh, well, that's good for you. If I die, I go to be with the Lord. And that's very much better. So which one do I choose? That's not the attitude that Elisha has here. And ultimately, Paul says, I'm going to remain on because there's still work to be accomplished. Things that God has ordered that I must do. Where are we going to find hope? Where are we going to find purpose? We're going to find it the exact same place that Elijah did. We're going to find it when we listen to God. We're going to find it when we do what God would have us to do. The prophets had a job. They were to speak for God to the people. If it was really as bad as Elijah saw it to be, Elijah should have been speaking up even more. Now, here's a challenge for us, because we all sit around and talk, and I know we do it. I've heard it. I participated in it. We talk about how bad the world's become, how much evil there is in the world. That's not an excuse to get quiet. That's a charge to speak up even louder, to talk to more people, to make certain that everyone has heard. And yet we often find ourselves, instead of doing that, essentially in the same place as Elijah. It happens the same way. We stop listening to God. It was when Elijah got quiet and listened to the voice of God. That's when he got up and moved again. That's when he began to do his work again. That's when he got busy again in the matters of faith. That's when he remembered that God was with him. He was not alone. And even I only am left, for they seek my life to take it away. No, Elijah, even if you're right, and there's not any other faithful people in the land, you're not only left. God has demonstrated himself very, very obviously to be with you, to hear your cry, to respond to your prayers with the drought, with the altar and sacrifice, with his victory over the prophets of Baal, with the ending of the drought. With the angel of the Lord speaking to him, with the Lord making himself known just over and over and over again. He should have known that he was not alone. God's with us when we listen and go, every day that we listen and go, everywhere that we listen and go, in every circumstance. When we listen and go, not just when we're enjoying our great victories, but even in persecution. Even when our enemies are setting out to stop our mouths or defeat us ultimately by taking our life, as it was in the case of Elijah. And I'm reminded by the instructions of Jesus to his disciples, when I hear this instruction that God gives to him, go and do these things. Jesus say, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. That's ultimately the same message that Elijah received. Elijah, go and do the things that you're appointed to do. Fulfill your work. I am with you. We need to remember that. If we lose sight of that, that's when we lose our hope. When we lose sight of that, that's when we think that the task is lost. When we lose sight of that, that's when we quit going and proclaiming. That's when we quit baptizing. And that's when we quit teaching all things which he has commanded us. And that last phrase, in what we refer to as the Great Commission, that last phrase, I think sometimes we put the emphasis in the wrong place. When he says, go and teach all that I've commanded you, he's saying that we have an obligation to share everything. He's already said, preach to all people. Now he's defining what we teach, every commandment. To any and all who will hear, they can find the same hope, the same confidence, the same trust, the same faith that Elijah had displayed in chapter 18 and lost in chapter 19. And by the way, in learning that he regained that faith back and went out and did the things that God instructed for him to do, and the things came to pass that God desired to come to pass, we learn that even if we have found ourselves in one of those low places where we have lost our way and lost our faith and lost our hope, we also can be renewed. We can once again demonstrate in our lives the faith which God has sent. That's the challenge for me and the challenge for you and the challenge for us in this community as we strive to be the pillar and support of the truth and to fulfill the mission that God has given his children to do. To go and preach and teach and share all of this good news, that men and women from all walks of life and all corners of our city may find salvation in our Lord. May God give us the strength and the courage to get up and go and to share.
God is calling the prodigal, come without. Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, wake the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. 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 Though you are far away, wonderful story of love. Still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain.